What's the most scariest true story you have heard?
I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friend told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, and afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. There is a freak story that never leaves me. A guy went missing in 2004. He had left home without shoes or jacket in October, and just before he disappeared he had called his friends and asked if they wanted to come and go to sauna with him, like a normal Finnish person might do on a Friday night. His girlfriend came from work to an empty home with lights on and the front door open. Case went cold and the guy was not found. 4 years later, kids were playing in the woods near the missing guy's home and noticed a scarecrow high in a spruce tree. They told their parents, who came to investigate and immediately called the police. It was not a scarecrow, it was the body of the guy who went missing 4 years before. He was tied to the tree and the body had been there for the whole time the guy was missing. It was officially ruled as a suicide. Now, the weird thing is that according to people on some Finnish crime websites, the rope wasn't tied to his neck like it would be if he tried to hang himself and got stuck in a tree. He sat on a branch facing the trunk, and his body was tied from 3 or 4 places to the tree. That doesn't really scream suicide to me. The guy was a drug user, and had been in prison for drugs too. Some people on those websites think that his sudden disappearance and strange death might be related to drug debts. Did someone force him to climb the tree and tie himself up like that? Maybe he died of hypothermia up there, since temperatures in Finland in October can drop below zero, and the debt collectors just left his body. Another strange thing is, that newspapers didn't tell where he was found and how he died, just that some kids found him near his home and there was no crime. This story is so weird it has disturbed me ever since I heard it. Was at a bonfire where people were telling ghost stories, and a friend told us this story about his aunt in Mexico. Back when she was a little kid, 6 or 7 I think, they lived on a ranch near some mountains, and one day she was out playing and ended up going missing. A lot of people from the area came to help look for her, call for her, but nothing. I think he said like a week went by and the family had begun to give up hope. Then suddenly she comes from out of the trees, dirty and with her mouth sewn shut. The family takes her to the hospital immediately. The story the little girl tells is that she was wandering around the trees and some duende came out and asked her to play with them. So she goes with them in the woods, and when she starts to get hungry, they tell her she needs to stay, so she does. But then it starts to get dark, so she eventually finds her way back home. She apparently thought she was just gone for a couple of hours and not a week. But, apparently after that the girl was never the same, and she grew up to be a very quiet and reserved woman. He says she still has the scars from where her mouth was sewn shut. So while everyone at the time was telling stories about how duende are 100% real and some people had even seen them when visiting their families in Mexico, that's definitely scary on its own. But for this story in particular, what's scary is that this 7-year-old girl was taken from her family ranch and held hostage in the woods for a week, where she was so tortured that she ended up blocking out what happened to her and came up with a story in order to cope. And then people who took her sewed her mouth shut, probably thinking she would die before she ever made it back to her family's home. Edit, spelling. My old boss once nonchalantly divulged the following story at an end-of-year Christmas party. He had built a home in the Victorian countryside during the 80s. During the build, he would often drop in first thing before work to see the previous day's efforts and greet the tradesmen. He was in the process of laying the garage foundation, when he was surprised to see the builders had already set up and were in the midst of pouring the foundation upon his arrival. He implied that this meant they had been working throughout the night and early morning to have it completed to this stage. A flustered builder rushed to meet him halfway down the driveway and explained that his guys were needed elsewhere during the day, hence the ridiculously early start, and that his presence wasn't necessary, so he left for work. The following months after the garage had been completed, he would often notice that a layer of brown dust would seep through the concrete, which he would need to sweep away. It eventually stopped appearing. Fast forward a year or so from his home's completion, he saw that the builder was being investigated for a semi-high-profile disappearance of a TV model who he was in a relationship with. He said she appeared on the Australian sale of the century. He explained that he never pursued it with the authorities as he didn't want his house ripped apart in search for a body buried in the foundation. He has since sold the place. It naturally put bit of a downer on the rest of the party as everyone apart from him was horrified. He promptly attempted to joke the story away and change the topic once he got impression that those of us listening didn't find the story as scandalous as he did. I've since tried to Google the story regarding a missing TV model, however have come up with nothing. So it's hard to know how much truth there is to the story. Or even if it's possible for corpse residue to seep through dried concrete. Not sure if this fully answers your question as I can't confirm truth, but it does creep me out. TL, Doctor, my old boss thinks a dead model is buried in the foundation of his house, but did nothing about it. This goes back a couple of years. It was the summer of my sophomore year in high school and I was working at a local pizza joint and had gotten off early. I called my buddy up and we made plans to go over to our other buddy's farm after he was off of work. We got there early and let ourselves in the pasture and ran around, shot some arrows until we got bored. We then decided that we would go for a walk down the road until we reached the private property sign and the road turned to gravel. We kept walking about a quarter mile until we saw some fresh tire tracks that went into some deep bushes. We followed the tire tracks and saw a cream 1990s Toyota 4Runner deep in the brush. I approached from the right and my friend approached from the left. As I got closer I saw what looked like someone had wiped something off of the passenger's side of the windshield. We parked inside and the back seats were down and there was a sheet draped over a figure. We looked at each other and ran back to the farm where we either had to make a decision on if we were going to call the cops or just let it slide. Being on private property we were afraid to get in trouble ourselves. We decided to wait for our friend to get back to his farm and we would take him up there and see for himself. After a second trip up there all three of us realized that this car was not meant to be here and something was in the back. We went back to the farm as it was getting dark and decided we had to let an adult know, so we went to his neighbor who is a retired Air Force pilot. He grabbed his gun and his truck with floodlights and instructed us to show him where we found the car. We drove up past the private property sign and up the gravel road and parked the truck so we could see the hidden car. We all hopped out and he turned the floodlights on. Right as the lights went on, two men ran out from the back of the car and hopped in, put it in drive and accelerated out of there, skidding past you as we down out of the way. We ended up getting the license plate and contacting the police. As it turns out the car was registered to a missing person who still hadn't been found. After years of telling this story, someone pointed out the scariest thing about it that as a kid I had never realized. Those two men who drove off in that car had probably been watching us the whole time and had every chance to do whatever they wanted to. I just remembered this story from a former roommate. Happened after he found new shared living accommodations with an elderly 60+ YO gentleman that mostly kept to himself. My roommate traveled a lot for work and also met a girl who worked overseas, so he was in and out of that house days at a time visiting his GF. He barely saw the house owner a lot and got accustomed to it. One day after returning from 2-week trip, he returned home and didn't find his older roommate. No worries, he was exhausted and slept in the most of the weekend. Next week, still no sign of his roommate. Also, the house was starting to get a weird funky smell and an overall eerie atmosphere. By now you should know where this is heading at. It took a few more days before the owner's body was found. It was in his locked bedroom as he had died of a heart attack in his sleep sometime during the 2 weeks my friend was gone. And the discovery itself was pretty gross out. The old man had no other family members and so former roommate had to move soon. He was creeped out by the whole experience and fell into hard times for being suddenly homeless. Couch surfed for a while before finally moving in with his GF overseas. This happened in my late teens. I was with a group of friends and we decided to go camping. We always pick the same spot, simply because it's remote and it's by the river that runs out of the lake. There is one road in, and one road out. It's desolate. No cell service and on either side of the road are steep drops. It's so steep and rocky that it is hard to fathom anyone hiking up either side. There is a spot perfect for fishing under a little bridge that is on this road. We set up camp and it begins to get dark, so we decide we are going to do some catfishing and gather our things. All four of us head back up to the bridge. We get to the point where the bridge is in view when one friend nudges me and nods toward the bridge. There was a black figure pacing back and forth along the bridge. It was like a person, but it was so tall and skinny. Almost distorted looking. Like if you took a person and stretched them out taller. It was almost totally dark, but the figure was clear up against the moonlight. It's burned in my brain. We nope right out of there and start back down to our campsite thinking we can at least find safety in our vehicle. We make it about halfway back to our camp and see a huge fire in the middle of the road. Like it takes up a good 3/4 of the little dirt path. One of my friends managed to find a small but treacherous path around. We thankfully didn't have a lot of camping supplies and we threw them in the truck, loaded up and drove back, assuming we would have enough water/liquids to put the fire out with our ice chest full of half-melted ice and gallon jugs of water. We roll up to where the fire was and it's out. There is just a blackened spot in the road. We have not been back there. I'd what that was about. I'm sure it was some person messing with us. But I'd how they managed to do the stuff they did. Don't really care. It still scares the crap out of me. I grew up in a privileged upper middle to upper class town in New England. Very low crime rate, frequently rated among the safest places in the US to live on those types of lists. We collectively resided in a proverbial bubble of security. In 1999, I was a freshman in high school. It was Halloween, sometime around mid-morning or early afternoon, and the weather was crisp and clear, a perfect Sunday in autumn. I had invited my two best friends over to prep our spooky evening plans, horror movies, trick-or-treating, all the joys of my favorite holiday. It was gearing up to be an awesome day. Everything came to a grinding halt when news went out that someone had been brutally murdered mere blocks from where I lived. It is my understanding, although I have never looked it up personally, that it was the first murder in something like 50+ years in our town. The victim was 58-year-old wife and mother Mabel Grainder. The Grainders were an affable, respected, and well-off married couple of over 30 years. Their 3 grown kids had been in the same school grades as my older siblings, so my parents knew them on a level somewhere between stranger and polite acquaintance. They lived just a short stroll away from the town beach, a hotspot in the summer where families would go swimming in the local pond. I always loved going with my parents every July and August and walking the dirt path through the trees from the small parking lot to the sandy strip of beach to play and swim in the water. I never visited that pond again after learning of Mrs. Grainder's fate. Like many mornings before, she and her husband Dirk had taken a leisurely walk with their dogs on that wooded trail. According to the 911 call that her husband made, she had complained of some minor back pain, and he had walked on ahead. When she hadn't followed, he double-backed and found her, dead on the ground. Her skull had been smashed in with a blunt object, her throat slashed, and there were multiple stab wounds in her chest. Dirk claimed that he had seen a runner leaving the scene, a possible murderer on the loose. Of course, the news that a killer could be out running around put the whole town basically on a fear-based lockdown that Halloween. No trick-or-treaters came by our house, and I was definitely not allowed to go out that day. As the investigation unfolded, evidence that conflicted with Dirk's story mounted. The hammer that bashed Mabel's head in and the knife that inflicted the stab wounds were found in a nearby storm drain. Blood-stained gloves that were recovered matched the type that Dirk had another pair of in his home. The blood spatter on Dirk's clothes didn't line up with his story. Prosecutors later would state in court that they had discovered during their investigation that Dirk was living a seedy sex-addicted double life, with secret trysts with prostitutes and stashes of crazy hardcore porn. The husband was found guilty and is now in prison, but still stands by his story. I feel bad for his kids, who also remain steadfast in supporting that their father did not kill their mother. I'm sure this isn't remotely close to the scariest tale on here, but it genuinely rocked my hometown and the aftermath is still discussed there. Not crazy scary but kind of for us when it happened. I used to live in San Antonio and it was around Halloween, so we wanted to get some scares in. We decided to go see some real haunted asylums and the burned down house of the horse lady. The haunted asylum was pretty lame, so we got GPS coordinates of the horse lady's house and parked as close to it as we could and started walking. It was in the dead center of some woods. A solid 30-minute walk. There were 6 of us, but a guy and a girl decided not to go in for obvious reasons, and so the 4 of us journeyed onward. It was pitch black and only 2 of us had phones with about 20-ish battery left. Mine had a light and GPS open and the other guy kept his phone on him just in case. We walked and my phone died, but we were only like 5 minutes from the marker. My friend pulled out his phone light and we saw what could have been the burned down house, but we weren't sure. We heard a weird moan, but we figured it was some animal. Then the girl with us screams. A massive spider strings down in front of us. I mean, this thing was the size of my thumb. Pretty big fella, but whatever. The girl starts crying and we decide to just go back because it was a bust and it's a 30-minute walk back, plus it was late as hell. We figured we walked in a straight line, so a simple 180 and walking straight back would get us back home. We turned around, the guy flashes his light. I kid you not. Hundreds of these big spiders and massive spider webs are around us as if it happened the 2 minutes we stood in that spot. There's absolutely no way we walked 30 minutes without touching a single one of these webs. The girl is screaming bloody murder as we try to avoid 100 of these webs trying to make it back to the vehicle. Took us an hour and 15 minutes to get around the webs and spider, plus stopping to check each other for spiders whenever we hit a clear patch. None of us could explain what happened, but we were for sure scared.